six. I hope you're all well and keeping safe at home. This week I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our English. If we had been in school, we would have been looking at how our dialect and our informal speech comes into narrative writing quite well. If you have a little look at the board, you can see a screenshot of a phone. We're quite familiar with using informal speech and text speak, as we call it. Today we will be learning about informal speech. What's that? It says, listen carefully and you will find out. Okay, I'm gonna. So there's some phrases there I expect you can already recognise that are not standard English, and that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. Okay, so when we're writing a narrative, or when an author is writing a narrative, they will write in a very formal tone in their actual narrative script. The storytelling part is written in what we call standard English. And when they put a voice in of a character, they quite often give them some dialect, or they might use some abbreviations or contractions in the writing to show that they are using spoken English, which is much more informal. So I'll give you some examples. I'm going to get you to watch a couple of videos and then you can hear how the dialect is different.
Cleverest woman.
Can I help you?
Sausage, chat, seafood pizza, chat, Rochelle want chat.
Excuse me?
Hey, I'm talking to Rochelle! I can't believe you've just done that.
Yeah, I want chat.
Another chat.
I'm sorry, we're not a chip shop.
Whatever.
Nor a bank. You know, we're a building society.
Yeah, but new, but yeah, but new, but yeah, but new, but
We do current accounts, savings, mortgages.
Speak English.
We have no shareholders to pay dividends to. And our focus is our customers. Would you like an account?
Yeah. With ketchup on the side.
At Nationwide, we don't have any shareholders.
You don't do chicken nuggets.
Our focus is you.
So in that video, you could hear that the character behind the screen asking for mortgages was using a lot of slang in her voice, and the man in the bank, who was the bank teller, he was using a very formal tone in his voice. We're going to listen to another one.
Morning. As I'm sure you're aware, my name is Mr. Logan. I'm your new English teacher. Nice to meet you all. Hope you're all ready to get to grips with some Elizabethan literature. Let's all turn to page 53 in our poetry textbooks. I think we'll dive straight in with the bard himself.
Sir?
Yeah.
Are you English, sir?
No, I'm Scottish.
So you ain't English then?
No, I'm British.
So you ain't English then?
No, I'm not, but as you can see, I do speak English.
But I can't understand what you're saying, sir.
Well, clearly you can.
Sorry, are you talking Scottish now?
No, I'm talking English.
Right. Don't sound like it.
Okay, whatever you want. Now, let's get on with Shakespeare.
I don't think you're qualified to teach us English.
I am perfectly qualified to teach English.
I don't think you are though.
You don't have to be English to teach it.
Right. Have we got double English or double Scottish?
Is your name Lauren Cooper by any chance?
Yeah. Why?
Your reputation precedes you.
Any day.
Okay, so when you were listening to Lauren's voice, you could probably hear lots of ain'ts and in it and lots of slang language that she was using, whereas the teacher, who was played by David Tennant there, was using much more formal tone in his voice and speaking in standard English, or Scottish, as Lauren was taking the mickey out of. Okay, so if we think about how characters do this in story writing, how authors do this in story writing, I've got an example of a text here, which is taken from The Switch. Some of you have read The Switch by Anthony Horowitz, and he's got two really interesting characters, Eric and Doll Snarby, and they have really strong Cockney accents, and he shows that in the way that he writes their speech. So I'm going to read you a little section of where their voice and their dialect and dialogue has come into the writing. So you've got the standard. He had a bad cough. In fact, he was spluttering as much as the bacon in the pan. And what he says is, so you come back in, have you? Eric coughed. Just like you to shove off when it's your turn to do the cooking. Don't be cruel to the boy, Doll Snarby shouted. She reached out and jabbed hard in the ribs. That's my job. I suppose you want some bacon, Eric asked. Yes, please, Tad said. Oh, please, Eric sang the word in a falsetto voice. Haven't we got airs and graces today? He coughed again, spraying the bacon with spittle. He'll be saying thank you next and all. Oh, leave the little maggot alone, Doll said. She slid an empty place in front of Tad. Tad looked down. The plate was coated in grease. So hopefully from those examples you can hear the difference really clearly between the non-standard and standard English. There's a table on the board here just to give you some examples. Standard English we would say I did it, but if you use non-standard English we might hear the words I done it. Come quickly, you might hear someone say come quick if they were speaking it. The books that I bought, and you might hear someone saying the books what I bought. Those books, we might hear in non-standard them books. I didn't break it, I never broke it. I didn't break anything, I didn't break nothing. We started first, didn't we? We started first, isn't it? So you can hear grammatically that there are some errors in non-standard English, but quite often we say them and it comes across in our dialect. So that's what I want you to try and do today in today's writing. Okay, so the stimulus for today's writing is based on a drawing by a man by the name of Harris Burdick. As story has it, in 1954, Harris Burdick walked into a bookstore with a whole range of illustrations. He took in 14 illustrations and he had put a catch line with each of those illustrations. He told the bookstore owner that he would come back the following day with the stories that he'd written to go with those illustrations. However, he never returned the following day, and the bookstore owner spent the next 30 years looking for the elusive Harris Burdick. However, he never found him, and teachers today, and many people around the world today, use these images as a stimulus for story writing. We're going to have a look at one of those today. This is the image I want you to consider. It's called Just Dessert. And the catch line with this image here that you've got, I don't know how well you can see it, there's a picture on the Google Drive, so have a look at it. You've got a lady, she's got some quite piercing eyes. She's wearing quite old-fashioned clothing there, an old-fashioned pinafore type thing that someone would have worn if they were a slave or a cook perhaps in olden times. So you need to think about your era and your decade when your story writing might be set. She's holding a very large knife here, and this is a pumpkin that she's got on the table. She's obviously been doing some baking perhaps. She's got rolling pins and mixing bowls. And the catchphrase says, she lowered the knife and it grew even brighter. Now before I begin my writing, I'm going to think a little bit more about this character. When you see characters in different books that you might know, you might have noticed a particular dialect from Hagrid, for example, in Harry Potter, or you might have noticed the Japanese accent in Kenzuki's Kingdom from Kenzuki. We've talked about Dol and Eric from the Snarby. So I want you to think about how you might show a regional accent in your writing when you come to do it. So you need to also think about some of the words we use in speech and dialect, some of our contractions like don't and can't and didn't, and you're allowed to use contractions when you're writing speech. But there are other words that we sometimes say that are a bit more slang, like ain't and cos, tis, cor blimey, and the sorts of things you heard when you watched the videos earlier. So we need to think about our character, who that person is, before we start writing. So in my story, I've written you a model example. I've imagined that this young lady works as a cook in a particular house, and she's got a bit of an accent in her writing. Have a listen and you can see if you can pick it up. Mary was exhausted. The cold evening was drawing in and her day had been long and tiring. Strewn across the kitchen were the evidence. Bowls filled with pastry mix, dirty pots and pans, and flour scattered everywhere. Mary had spent the day baking for the master of the house, and she was now about to start the final dish, the dessert. She was making Mr. Bilby's favourite pumpkin pie. I hope he appreciates all me hard work, Mary exclaimed to no one in particular. Tibbles, the farmhouse cat, lifted his head and pricked one ear in her direction as if to acknowledge her, but then settled back down to continue his nap by the kitchen stove. As Mary hoisted the freshly picked pumpkin onto the worktop, she groaned with the weight of it. All these years of being Mr. Bilby's maid was taking its toll on her back. She rubbed it vigorously to temporarily relieve the pain. Right, let's get you chopped up, she exclaimed to the pumpkin, as if somehow giving it a warning. Then, as she lowered the knife, the pumpkin seemed to glow. She jumped back, astonished. Had she imagined it? It must have been the candle flickering, she told Tibbles, with a nervous edge to her voice. Tibbles had shot to the back door when Mary startled him. She lifted the knife again, and this time the pumpkin grew even brighter. So you can hear in my writing that I put the phrase, this time the pumpkin grew even brighter, at the very end to leave my reader on a cliffhanger. But I hope you noticed how I put in some dialect in the writing, and I punctuated it to show where you had missing letters. And by having those missing letters, you then read it differently when you come to read the text through. The rest of the writing is written in very standard English. So I want you to have a go this week, thinking about all your different writing tools and techniques that you've got at writing a narrative short description that sets your character in the scene in the kitchen, and somewhere in your writing you're going to have that phrase, she lowered the knife and the pumpkin grew even brighter. Good luck. I look forward to hearing some of them.